My presentation looks at some of the issues related to actually implementing licensing and also takes it from a slightly different point of view. Inspire focuses directly on making public sector information available, i.e. government at any level of government. The European Commission has also been running a program for about 25 years now on trying to increase the size of the information market in Europe. And that raises some other issues on looking at the licensing aspect, the business models behind using this public sector information. So I'd like to briefly go through these main topics. I'm going to step through some of the slides a little quickly so that we have time for the last two presentations in the project, but towards the end we'll see the complexities that come in trying to put together a licensing regime. I guess the best practice, if there was one, in some political circles would simply be to make everything open data. Put everything in the public domain. It's freely available, do whatever you want, no restrictions on use, reuse, or anything else. But there are then other political regimes where they're still trying to cover costs that this is an unacceptable solution. And I think Ante Jacobsen said it in the previous session, the whole licensing situation is so complex that trying to harmonize licenses into even just a small collection of typical licenses is probably not going to happen anytime soon. Anyway, we were supposed to be showing you some best practice examples, and sadly I think it's a bit more complicated than that. We still have quite a ways to go. We can specify frameworks for best practice in licensing, or good practice as we would call it, but how you implement that in information products and services that might involve a lot of different products from a lot of different people, i.e. different government bodies, including maybe commercial providers as well, is another issue. So, open data is wonderful. It would be good if we all had open data and that was free. There's a difference. Open data doesn't necessarily mean free data. Even the Inspire Directive says the data must be made available. The PSI Reuse Directive says it must be made available, but it doesn't have to be made available for free. It simply has to be made available. So, how do you build an information economy around products that are all free, as in no cost? That doesn't happen. In the geo domain, we have many governments that have open data initiatives and even open data regulations, i.e. data is available without restriction. But when you look more closely, even those who've had this as a policy for some years, you will still find some portion of the data has not been totally free. It's been available, but you had to pay for it. Cadastral information was typical in the states where I've done work in Europe and outside of Europe. Some of this is now changing. The Open Data Drive is much bigger now than it used to be. If you go to this website that they've produced in the US, you'll find information on 32 different states that are actively producing or pushing open data policies. This is mainly driven by e-government activities, because GI is nothing, public sector geospatial information is nothing more than public sector information that has a location attribute. And quite often people in the geo community forget that. If it's government data first. It's geospatial government data after you find a location attribute in it. Move that one on. So where are we? So when we're looking at the need to implement licensing regimes, we have to be careful to distinguish between public sector information and commercial data products and services that are using that data, because they also have to have licensing regimes. And it would be not too sensible to have, or not practical, to have two different types of license systems set up. The licensing system you need to implement control, whether it's restrictions on use or monitoring use or whatever type of license it may be, can apply to all different cases. And even open government data has to have some control on it. Otherwise, the only option would be to put it in the public domain, make it totally freely available without restrictions of use. So you still have to have a way to monitor what's going on. And as far as building the information market goes, to generate revenue, we're talking about controlling your IPR, your intellectual property rights. Information is a very valuable asset. And companies who take the government data, add value to it, and resell it as public services or products, they're generating revenue, they're creating employment. This is one of the edicts behind all the studies on why we should make more government data openly available, because it helps increase the size of the market itself. And that's also going to include some licensing. We talked about free and open data, which still requires a business model. The main laws covering your information assets, our copyright law, and it's certainly in the European Union, the separate laws we have on database rights, which don't exist outside the EU. That's caused a bit of friction in some of the global markets where we operate. There's also laws relating to competition, consumer protection, privacy, lots of other things than just open data. For example, cadastral data, the boundaries might be made freely available in unrestricted use, but a lot of the information about the cadastre itself could not be made available because it would violate privacy regulations. So you've got to take the whole plethora of laws around geospatial information into account. Now, we started funding information market projects under the information market programs beginning in 1988 here in the European Union. There's been 5 four-year programs. I think they've spent something like 600 million euro in total, although that didn't all go to the geo field. Let me state this had to do with digital libraries, multimedia, multilingualism, etc. And we've looked at different types of ways to promote the information market, and most of these things also had to look at ways to control the IPR and the products that were being sold. Obviously, if you've got an information market program that is pushing the sale of data, you can't make it freely available. These projects were all supposed to produce products and services to increase the size of the market. And then we have the EU directive on PSI reuse, which is being updated right now. So online access to PSI from government bodies it's quite common now to find click-use licenses. This also goes back to the e-government initiatives from some years ago. Again, geospatial PSI is still PSI. But even the click licenses, or license terms in general, if you look at the complexity that arises, they can be associated with specific users, or a type of user, or an organization, or a type of use, a permitted type of reuse, the amount of data you access, and how it's used. There's lots of parameters come into play when you start talking about accessing and using and reusing licensing, reusing data. And this diversity aspect is what makes it such a complicated subject. A few years ago, the Creative Commons copyleft licenses came about. This has taken on a national role now. It's used quite widely, a global role. It's been adopted by a lot of countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. They're looking at using Creative Commons licenses, the Netherlands. And a lot of this, again, is for government data. It can be used by anyone. I publish a lot of my papers claiming a Creative Commons license, a CC. It might be by attribution. You can do anything you want with what I publish, but just tell people that it came from me. So there's a whole list of the 6 basic types of licenses which you can get from creativecommons.org. There's also an initiative called the Open Data Commons that have an open database license, because the Creative Commons licenses are basically a type of normal copyright. In other words, protecting IPR and text and documents. Digital rights management, we also started looking at well back in the early 90s. How do you implement digital rights? How do you manage the rights on digital material, which can be so easily copied, reused, and you have trouble tracking that reuse? The GeoDRM, Geographic Digital Rights Management and Movement, started in 2004 with the OGC. And it's not the OCG. I hope Athena's not in the audience. I get it right in a later slide. The Open Geospatial Consortium. Their work later led to 2 ISO standards. We'll look in a minute that these haven't been implemented quite so far yet. And what benefit will they actually be to the information market if these 2 standards were implemented? Now, just to look at DRM itself for a moment. The original digital rights management started looking at music, multimedia generally. It had nothing to do with geospatial data. And it's been around for quite a long time. You've all seen it in your protected CDs, protected DVDs, protected websites, etc. It was based a lot on technology. It was technology focused. Let's find a way to secure information, and then you have to pay for it to be released. It was designed to prevent reuse as opposed to encouraging reuse. And what we're trying to do today, certainly with government data, is encourage the reuse of the data. This is what the PSI reuse directive is about. So a lot of the technical DRM hasn't worked yet. And the reason I can say that is I'll ask my audience question. How many of you have some form of media on your favorite digital device that was required maybe without paying for it, or borrowed from someone, or taken off the web when maybe you should have signed up and paid $2 or $20. Usually a lot of hands go up if they're being honest. This is typical of why it is so difficult to control digital media. So, the standards that came about following the Open Geospatial Consortium building process were 19149, the Rights Expression Language for Geographic Information, GRL, and then this year, very late last year, 19153, a GeoDRM reference model. What's happened with these standards? Not a lot. I haven't found anyone yet who's actually implementing these. If you look at something like the metadata requirement for Inspire, the licensing aspect, if it gets down to restrictions of use, there's 2 fields in the 18 metadata fields that have anything to say about access or use, and they're completely free text fields. So you can put anything you want into the Inspire metadata. This isn't going to help some automated software agent decide how to relate to your database when you're trying to access the data, pay for it, or create a new product. And this is where we need something much more complicated, which is what, or say more comprehensive, which is where these standards came about. But again, so far nobody has really implemented them. And to work those standards into information management workflows, which is what we're talking about here, taking a data product from one or more sources, adding some value to it, creating a new product, this is not an easy thing to do. I'm going to step through these. This has to do with the fact that once we start working with information and building it into information products, we're not talking about simply accessing cadastral data from a cadastral agency in a country. We're not talking about taking that data, combining it perhaps with environmental data, maybe with some transport data, maybe with some weather data, and coming up with a new product or service. So how do you handle the licensing for that whole workflow, for that whole management stream? This is not that easy to do. We're talking about repackaging the data to use it in original new ways, and this was the heart of the information market program. Take existing data, add some value, be innovative, and re-release it to create some new input to the economy. Again, this diversity comes in. We have different types of data, different types of ownership, different types of owner, government, non-government, different types of use, intended use, etc. It's a very complex thing. We'll go through this for just a second to move on. So let's get on to the EU-funded information market programs. Here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I guess, 10 projects out of about 17 that were funded in the last 12 years of the information market activity. There are 2 or 3 new ones we just funded at a review session last week in Luxembourg. And the numbers behind them are the value of the EU contribution, and most of these projects were only 50% funded. So we're looking at fairly significant sums of money being put into information market projects, all of which were supposed to either produce new products or services or help implement Inspire by looking at the issues behind Inspire. And what we found in many of the cases, I mean, ESDIN had the European Spatial Data Infrastructure Best Practice Network, had an entire work package focusing on business models and licensing. One Geology Europe had a section looking at licensing. The GS Soil people, which we just finished their project review Thursday last week, they had a section looking at licensing. They'll be presenting their project later this week. You can see that these projects all had some focus on them to do with licensing. They were only part funded, they needed to have a European dimension, and there was an actual focus in the call for these projects to come up with a business model, some sort of sustainability path into the future. And I guess the lessons we learned from that activity, first of all, unless there is a specific work package requiring projects like this to focus on business modeling or licensing or DRM or something similar, they basically don't do it. They get wrapped up in the technology and new web services, et cetera. So the licensing, et cetera, is left by the wayside. Where we did have business modeling or licensing and sustainability as a specific work package, some good results were achieved. But we didn't actually come up and say, okay, here's the world's best license model you should use. And we'll look at one of my very last slides, we'll see perhaps why. It has to do with this complexity again. Not just the complexity of what you're doing with the data, but the complexity of how you're building multiple data sources into new products and services, and that might span legal jurisdictions, cross-boundary data. We're looking at pan-European products and services. It gets very complicated. To take an example of the Euro DEM, this is taken from a paper that was published in the International Journal of SDI Research, which there are copies laying around the building. It's one of the papers in this extract that was produced by Joint Research Center. This is the journal that comes out of JRC. They said, okay, we've got this DEM model for Europe from Eurogeographics. What are we going to do with it? So there's different options on how you would then manage the customers. There were different options on what should the coverage be. Do I want full European coverage, just regions, just a country, maybe 2 countries, just some areas? I'm trying to do a license now that's going to cover all of these, okay? How am I going to price this? It's based on how many users in the organization, how much data I download, whether there's a royalty, is there a transaction fee, so I charge so much each time I take an item from the database. This is licensing. And if you look at this typical case, this is taken from that paper, we've got various license options across the top. We've got license periods. We've got EuroDM coverage, whether it's full, regions, country, area. We've got pricing options. And what you're saying is we need to come up with a licensing regime that will handle all of that complexity in one product, a EuroDEM. So we still have, quite a ways to go in that. So what happens? How do we actually go about doing this? We started looking for packages that would help us implement licensing in a regulated way for different types of clients, and about the only thing we've come across totally independently of Conterra was the license management package from Conterra, which is how I then got involved with Rudiger and his company and looking how this is being implemented in other countries right now. So that's where I hand over to you.